Have you ever noticed that Generation X rarely demands attention? They don't dominate social media. They don't constantly argue about identity. They don't loudly announce their struggles. And yet, they might be one of the most psychologically resilient generations alive. Generation X, born roughly between 1965 and 1980, grew up in a unique psychological environment. They were sandwiched between the idealistic optimism of the baby boomers and the hyper-connected emotional expressiveness of millennials. They didn't inherit post-war stability, and they didn't grow up with smartphones or constant digital reassurance. Instead, they grew up in uncertainty. One of the defining experiences of Gen X was the latchkey childhood. Rising divorce rates and two working-parent households meant many children came home to empty houses. They let themselves in after school, they handled their own homework, they managed their own boredom. There was no constant supervision, no endless emotional validation, and no algorithm feeding them stimulation. That early independence shaped something powerful: self-reliance. Gen X learned early that if something needs to be handled, you handle it yourself. At the same time, they grew up during economic recessions, corporate layoffs, political scandals, the Cold War, and rapid cultural change. Institutions didn't feel stable. Authority didn't always feel trustworthy. Promises didn't always hold. As a result, Gen X developed skepticism. They don't automatically trust systems. They question narratives. They assume structures can fail not because they're negative, but because their early environment taught them caution. Emotionally, Gen X was raised in a time when vulnerability wasn't publicly encouraged. Therapy wasn't normalized. Mental health conversations were limited. So instead of externalizing emotions, many learned to internalize them. Emotional restraint became common. They process internally. They don't overshare easily. And when things feel heavy, they often use dark humor. Sarcasm became armor. Understatement became strength. Humor became a coping mechanism. When it comes to work and life, Gen X values independence and authenticity. They prefer autonomy over micromanagement, results over performance, competence over visibility. They don't necessarily need public applause, they need freedom. They tend to be realistic rather than idealistic, cautious rather than blindly loyal. Once trust is earned, however, they are deeply loyal. Entering adulthood during economic instability further reinforced adaptability. They learned that careers are not permanent, corporations are not families, and stability can disappear. So they adapted. They diversified skills. They became flexible. They developed a quiet strategic mindset that doesn't panic easily when circumstances shift. Compared to millennials, Gen X tends to be less publicly expressive and less driven by validation. Compared to Gen Z, they are more private, less identity-focused, and more inclined to solve problems independently. They don't document every struggle. They observe, adjust, and move forward. Because they don't demand recognition, they're often called the forgotten generation. But being overlooked doesn't mean being weak. Beneath their calm exterior is a generation shaped by transition, uncertainty, and rapid change. They didn't grow up in comfort, they grew up in adaptation. At their psychological core, Gen X embodies independence, emotional discipline, skepticism, adaptability, realism, and dark humor. They may not be the loudest generation, but they are durable. They learned early that security is fragile, authority can fail, and resilience is built quietly over time. So maybe Generation X isn't emotionally distant. Maybe they're emotionally disciplined. Maybe they're not forgotten. Maybe they simply never needed the spotlight to begin with.